So we're glad that you're here. In fact, because it's April Fool's Day, what an incredible opportunity for us to look at something that many people would say, you're a bunch of fools. You're a bunch of fools sitting here and celebrate the fact that someone rose from the dead, because that can't happen. But the truth is, it did happen. It's a powerful reality, and I hope you know that. And I hope that you're in the midst of that, that's why you're here to celebrate. But regardless, it's something that we want to pursue, and it's a perfect time to ask the question, because it's April Fool's Day. In fact, you know why we celebrate April Fool's Day? No, you don't, because no one knows why we celebrate April Fool's Day. Really, nobody knows why we celebrate April Fool's Day. There's many theories and many ideas, perhaps, and probably the one that most people believe why is when we changed from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar in 1852. Because, 1582, excuse me. In 1582, we followed the Julian calendar created by Julius Caesar. And it was a time that the New Year's Day was celebrated on April 1st, marked on March 25th, but celebrated April 1st. And so later on, Pope Gregory decided that he wanted to redo the calendar to one that made more sense in terms of the seasons and how things changed. And so he came up with a new calendar that determined that January 1st was New Year's Day. And so anybody who continued to follow the old calendar, the Julian calendar, and celebrate on April 1st, they were considered, guess what? A fool. And so people would trick them, or they would make fun of them because they were following the old ways. And so regardless of why we celebrate it, I don't know about you, but I love April Fool's Day because I love to play practical jokes on people. It doesn't even have to be April Fool's Day. I'm going to play a practical joke if I get an opportunity. And that's just the way I am. I'm not a mean person just when I'm playing a prank on someone, because it's something about April Fool's Day. Some part of us, if we're honest, we like to make other people look foolish, and we laugh at that, right? It's just what we do. And you know, I've looking back, I've pulled some pretty good practical jokes on people. In fact, one of the favorite ones I've ever done, aside from pranking our children's ministry director, Brendan Fowler, this morning. It was awesome. Ask him about it. He's mad at us right now. He'll get over it. But I had a friend who was traveling cross country. And me and another buddy, we decided that we were going to prank him by taking a can of tuna and opening it and hiding it in his car. And at mile 100, it got even better, because when he discovered that one, he didn't realize we also hit a second one really good. And so in mile 200, he was really upset with us when he finally found the second one, right? It was good. You should try it. Worked pretty good. But I've also had my fair share. Like when someone exchanged my shampoo with Nair hair remover. No, I'm just joking. That's not what happened. But literally, I was at a conference, and my team, they took an alarm clock, and they hid it in my room, and they set it to 3 a.m. And at 3 a.m., it went off, and I had no idea where it was at. That was a good one. That was a good one. It worked really well. But you know, it's depending on how you feel about April Fool's jokes or pranks or whatever, it's a great time for us to look at the idea of the resurrection. And since it's April Fool's Day, what a better time to question it? Because just for a moment, what if we're all been duped? What if it was an April Fool's prank pulled off from some guys who had been following Jesus, who lost their leader and didn't want their movement to end? How do you and I know that they just didn't decide to pull the wool over everybody and pull off this amazing prank that the whole world fell for, and you and I are a bunch of fools in this room today because of it? See, because the truth is, people have been asking this question ever since the beginning. Did Jesus really raise from the dead? From the very first Easter, people had posed this question. Did it really happen? We know Jesus lived and died, historical fact. But did he really raise from the dead? See, because if he didn't, then they're right. And we're just a bunch of fools on April Fool's Day sitting in a room celebrating something that didn't happen. But if it's true, if it did happen, that a man who claimed to be God died on a cross and 3 days later came out of the grave alive, then he proved something. He proved that you and I have to pay attention to what he said. He proved that you and I have to pay attention to the way he asks us to live. And that should change everything for you and for me in that regard. And so today I just want to look at the idea that was the resurrection a prank? I believe there's 4 facts that we can look at to help us understand how we know that the resurrection really happened. It wasn't a prank. And the first one, to prove that the resurrection wasn't a prank, we have to show that Jesus wasn't pretending to be dead. I mean, you think about this. You can't rise from the dead if you're still alive. And so if it was a prank and Jesus never really died, then no resurrection ever happened. In fact, many people have proposed this, that perhaps Jesus didn't die. After his brutal beating and hanging on a cross, he was suffering from so much pain and trauma that he passed out. And he went into a comatose state. And simply 3 days later, he woke up. He woke up and came out of the tomb alive. And it's interesting. We have to look at that. See, because when someone is declared clinically dead. It's a medical term for the cessation of the blood circulation and our body taking in oxygen, our lungs functioning, because those two are criteria for sustaining life. And if those two don't happen, then someone's dead. And history tells us that Jesus was crucified by Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers were experts in the executions. And that's what they did for a profession. In fact, there was a tremendous penalty to be paid by any Roman soldier who didn't follow through on their assignment. It was capital punishment if they didn't hold a criminal to the sentence that they had, or if they allowed them to escape. And for this reason, Roman soldiers were brutal and meticulous in executing their orders to precision. See, that's why we look at Jesus and what he suffered for you and I. It was because these guys, they took the job very serious. And they were to make sure that Jesus was executed. In fact, the Bible records that for us, the death of Jesus in John 19. It says, now it was the day of preparation. And the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Now, the reason they would break the legs is because if someone was hanging on a cross, to catch their breath, they would rise their legs up and they would expand their lung capacity and they'd be able to breathe and capture their breath. But if their legs were broken, they couldn't do that. And they would suffocate faster on the cross. And so the soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing down a sudden flow of blood and water. So the Romans were told to make sure they executed them faster. And so they broke the legs of the first two guys, but when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. And just to be sure, one of the soldiers took a spear and thrust it into Jesus' side. And the Bible tells us, history tells us, that blood and water flowed out. What that proved was something known as pleural effusion. It's when the heart stops beating and the lungs no longer breathe, that the fluids inside of our body begin to surround the capacity or the chamber around our lungs and our heart. And it fills with water and blood. And so when he pierced his side, it proved that Jesus was dead. It proved the effects. See, by all accounts, professional executionists, on order for their own lives, declare Jesus dead. And not just the soldiers, but the disciples as well. They cared for his body after they took him off the cross. And if there was any sign of life, they wouldn't have followed through putting him in a tomb. Look at Mark 15. It says, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. You stop and think about this for a moment. Here's a guy who loved Jesus so much and was discovering what life was all about, and then suddenly he was gone. He has a desire to take care of his body, and so he asked permission to do that, and he's granted the permission. So probably, most likely, with the help of his disciples, they removed Jesus' body off the cross. You think about that. They had to take the nails out of his hand and nails out of his feet. And they had to deal with the wounds and the many things that he had gone through. And they had to transport his body from the cross to a place where he was buried, a tomb. And then they had to take care of his body, and they had to wrap it in linens, most likely soaked in balms and ointments, weighing perhaps 30 pounds, and wrap it around Jesus, and then place him in a tomb. At any time in that process, you would have think that if they sensed the faint heartbeat, or they sensed anything about him trying to grasp breath or anything, they would not have carried it through. They would have not gone through this. They would have never put him in a tomb because there was a hope of life. And yet after the Romans declared him dead, the disciples confirmed he was dead by wrapping him up and placing him in a tomb. And that's why not only did they place him on a tomb, they guarded that tomb. It was sealed. It's because the next fact for the resurrection that it wasn't a prank is that Jesus' body didn't just disappear. Hey, you think about this. Where did the body go? See, because we've all seen the magic trick where the magician stands on a stage, picks some unsuspecting guest out of the audience and invites him up on the stage, puts him in a box, closes it, waves the wand, says abracadabra, opens the box, and body's gone. Where'd he go? And we wonder that question, only to somehow do something and there they appear again. And who's to say that somehow the disciples didn't pull some kind of smoke and mirror trick, making us believe that he was there and then he wasn't there and then suddenly he was back again. And so we have to ask the question, if the disciples were behind this deception and they stole the body, we have to think, well, how'd they do it? How'd they pull that off? See, because we know that the tomb was heavily guarded. Matthew 27. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees, they went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. And that last deception will be worse than the first. See, this is the irony of this whole thing. The guys who wanted to snuff Jesus out, who put him on the cross, they were thinking that they were going to be deceived, that they were going to be tricked, that they were going to be fooled. And so they made sure everyone was on notice. This is not going to happen on their watch. And so they made sure that everyone was paying attention, that this couldn't happen. And look how Pilate answers them. So he says, take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and they made the tomb secure by putting a sill on the stone and posting the guard. See, they were making sure that no one was going to get away with the deception. They were not going to be fooled on that Easter. And yet, what we know is they put a Roman detail on the job. A Roman detail typically included 50 soldiers who would take turns over the next 3 days in most likely teams of 4 to make sure that nobody would bother that tomb, that nobody would break that seal. And they at their own lives, if they failed in their task, it would cost them their life. And so we have to believe that military trained, seasoned soldiers who are on an assignment that would cost them their life if they blew it, were somehow overcome by fishermen and accountants who were alone in fear for their life. And yet, that's exactly what we're led to believe, that somehow they failed in that. And history tells us that the very men who killed Jesus to shut him down tried to cover up the resurrection by claiming, yeah, this was just one big prank. Matthew 28. Some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. Guys, the body's missing. It's gone. And we don't know what to tell you. And when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised the plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has widely been circulated among the Jews to this very day. See this? Deception points to an April Fool's joke that the leaders, the guys who didn't want anything to do with Jesus, pulled, not the disciples. But let's just say, let's just play it out. Let's just say somehow the disciples were able to pull off stealing the body of Jesus. That would mean that these former fishermen and accountants, untrained in any military exercise or conflict, who are, by the way, hiding for their own lives, because their plan at this point was to get out of Dodge. Their plan was, we don't want to be killed like our leader was just killed. We're just as culpable. We need to get out of here. And yet somehow they mustered the courage to attack a Roman detail, overcome them, steal the body of Jesus, and come up with a plan to say, yeah, he's actually alive. And to do this, on top of that, they would have to devise that plan and convince each other to swear to never tell anyone they were lying. To never tell anyone it was a prank. See, but the problem with that is our next fact. The disciples couldn't fabricate the resurrection. They couldn't make this stuff up. In fact, there are many reasons that people would devise a plan like this or come up with a lie. I mean, we've probably all done it. A moment when someone would think something bad of us, ill of us, and so we make something up to make ourselves look better, right? To say whatever we have to say to get what we want, or we'll say anything so we can stay out of trouble, right? And we've all done it, and yet there comes a moment when we're exposed for the lie that we've told or the spin we've put on something, that we have a choice. Either we stick to the lie or we save our lives. And see, history records that if the disciples made this up, history tells us that all of them went to their death, were executed because they believed the resurrection happened. So I don't know about you. I don't know about the disciples. But if I've made up a lie and it's going to cost me my life, I made it up. Don't take my life. It was a joke. It was a joke. Don't do it. In fact, if I was a disciple, I'd say, Peter did it. It was his fault. He came up with a plan. Just don't kill me. Right? I mean, that's what I would do because I'm not going to die for a lie. It was made up. There's no need to die for that. And yet, no one ever cracked. No one ever came clean. They all went to their death believing the resurrection happened because they knew the resurrection happened. They didn't prank it. They didn't come up with it. In fact, the Apostle Paul even admits that if the resurrection didn't happen, everything the disciples believed and lived for and would be foolishness, and you and I would be fools for being in this room today. Look what he says, 1 Corinthians 15. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. See what the key is? It's not foolishness to believe something that actually happened. It's not foolishness to believe the truth. And see, that's why the disciples knew what happened. It was living proof that it wasn't a lie. It was living proof that the resurrection really happened. And that gets us to our final fact for the proof of the resurrection, that it wasn't a prank, is that there's no faking a changed life. You can't fake the transformation that a resurrection will do in someone's life. And it started that first Easter morning. See, the disciples were forever changed in that moment. Their leader had just been crucified as an enemy of the state. They were in hiding. They were devising their get-out-of-town plan, and they could be next. But within days of the resurrection, suddenly these guys who are in fear for their own lives and hiding are out on street corners and public squares announcing that Jesus is alive, that he's risen from the dead and he has changed their lives. You can't fake that. Their lives were forever changed. Because of the resurrection, they had a new hope. They had a new courage. They had a new purpose for living. And they weren't afraid to share that because they knew it happened. And for the last 2,000 years, that truth, the power of the resurrection, has been transforming lives. It's been changing lives. People who were hopeless and downcast, who had no courage, no reason to live, their lives have been changed because the resurrection happened. In fact, the truth about that, it's going to change your life. In fact, I know that there's no way in these 25 minutes of this just time that we're having this conversation could change much. But I would encourage you to continue to investigate this, because once you understand what Easter's all about, that's when you'll understand what life with Jesus is all about. And so we have a gift for you if you're interested. It's a book called The Case for Easter. It was written by Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was an atheist, but he was also an investigative journalist. And he decided that he was going to investigate this preposterous, this foolishness about believing in the resurrection. And you know what happened in this process? He became a follower of Jesus. His life was forever changed because he found out the proof of the resurrection. And we would encourage you to continue to seek that out. And if you want this book, all you have to do is go to the info center, fill out a card, and we'll give you one. In fact, I don't know if it's because I've been doing such a good job of creating interest or I haven't explained it enough, but we only had like 5 books left. So if you go and you want one, just fill out a card and let us know if you didn't get the book. Put a note on it. Someone will help you in the info center, and we'll get one to you if you don't get one today. Because we really want you to be convinced of the truth of the resurrection, because it'll change your life. See, because when we realize that Jesus didn't just die on a cross to make things right with you and God, but he also went to a tomb, and 3 days later he came out, that's when we understand what Easter's all about. But that's when we begin to discover what life with Jesus is all about.